He told me everything was fine, Aisha whispered, staring at her empty wine glass, the dim lights of Victoria Island flickering through her apartment window. Every promise, every dream, all lies. Have you ever trusted someone so completely, only to find out the person you gave your heart to was playing a different game entirely? If that happened to you, what would you do? Would you forgive or let fate decide? It was past midnight, the streets of Lagos alive with restless energy, neon reflections bouncing off wet pavements, the distant roar of traffic like a drumbeat of impending doom. Aisha stood clutching her cracked phone, the device now holding the truth she had been too afraid to see. Tonight she finally saw it. Earlier that evening, she had walked into the apartment she shared with Obinna, her boyfriend of 7 years, thinking it was a sanctuary. But the laughter and whispered dreams had been replaced by cold air, alien walls. Obinna's face was calm, almost casual. Aisha, it's not what you think, he said, voice trembling slightly, betraying the guilt he couldn't hide. Her mind flashed back to every suspicious moment. Late calls, he said, were work. Weekends at the office, contacts in his phone she had never seen. And tonight, the final piece fell into place. Aisha's tightened as she read the message on her screen. Not just betrayal, but deliberate, precise, orchestrated. Obinna had chosen someone else, someone she had trusted implicitly. Shock slammed into her heart. How could the man who promised forever, who spoke of shared dreams, do this? She sank into her chair, letting the weight of reality press down. Outside, Lagos throbbed on, indifferent to heartbreak. Yet deep inside, a quiet voice whispered she was not alone. Perhaps fate was already moving, watching, ready to intervene. Aisha's fingers tightened around the phone. Tears threatened but did not fall. Anger mingled with resolve. She would not be a victim. Not tonight. Not ever. Somewhere in the shadows, she knew the game had changed, and she would play it on her terms. But fate had its own plan. The next morning, Aisha returned to work as if nothing had happened. Obinna's betrayal had to remain a secret for now, yet every glance, every whispered conversation in the office reminded her that she had the power to reclaim control. She began quietly observing, noting patterns in decisions, predicting behavior, slowly building an invisible web of influence. She wasn't ready for revenge yet. She was preparing. Weeks passed, and her subtle actions began to bear fruit. Small victories, unnoticed by others, gave her confidence. Obinna remained oblivious, proud, assuming he had the upper hand. The irony was delicious. Then came the turning point. A project Obinna boasted about, lucrative deal he had convinced everyone was entirely his idea, started falling apart. Aisha stepped in silently, fixing errors, streamlining decisions, saving what everyone thought would collapse. And no one suspected she had orchestrated the solution. Obinna's arrogance blinded him, but Aisha's patience sharpened. Her quiet triumph built slowly, until the day arrived when the truth would emerge. It was a rainy afternoon when Obinna finally realized the magnitude of her control. A board meeting, tense and critical, revealed that the investment portfolio he had flaunted was, in fact, thriving under decisions Aisha had quietly guided. He tried to claim credit, but the evidence was undeniable. Emails, spreadsheets, contacts, all tracked, curated, directed by her. His mouth opened and closed, fumbling, as colleagues exchanged astonished glances. Aisha remained calm, composed, even smiling slightly. She delivered her quiet justice. I trusted, I observed, I acted. You chose betrayal. And while you were busy laughing at me, I learned, I planned, and I executed. This is your wake-up call. Obinna was speechless, the full weight of his underestimation crashing down. The room once his domain was now hers. Subtly, irrevocably. Colleagues whispered, investors realized, and even friends who had doubted Aisha stood in awe. She had turned heartbreak into mastery, betrayal into empowerment. Weeks later, Aisha walked the streets of Victoria Island, rain-slicked pavement reflecting city lights. She thought back to the moment she discovered the betrayal, the pain she had felt, and the resolve it had sparked. The woman who had been discarded, betrayed, and laughed at had quietly become the one no one could ignore. Her actions had reshaped her life, reclaimed control, and delivered a lesson that would echo for years. Never underestimate patience. resilience, and the quiet force of someone who refuses to remain a victim. Fate had indeed been watching closely, and in the end, it had sided with her. The next week was a test of patience, and Aisha navigated it with quiet precision. Obina strutted through the office, chest puffed, smirking as if the world belonged to him. He boasted openly about deals she had helped salvage, laughed at colleagues who questioned his methods, and flaunted his control over every department. Yet every word he spoke, every arrogant glance fueled Aisha's resolve. She watched, calculated, and waited. The betrayal was raw, but so was the fire growing inside her. Every lie he told, every secret rendezvous, every attempt to gaslight her became a piece of the puzzle she meticulously memorized. Aisha knew Obina's weakness, his ego. She would use it. She would turn it against him. During lunch one day, she observed him in the conference room, laughing with the same woman who had betrayed her trust, his hand brushing hers casually. It should have broken her completely. Instead, a cold clarity settled in. The world would see only the surface Obina's arrogance, his supposed control, but behind that veneer, Aisha was building her empire silently. Emails, financial reports, project insights all passed through her hands first, invisible to the untrained eye. She was the shadow he did not notice, the hand guiding the wheel while he basked in the sunlight. A week later, a crucial presentation arrived, one that could make or break Obina's claim to a multi-million naira deal. He prepared as usual, confident, smug. Aisha knew the errors he overlooked, the miscalculations hidden in spreadsheets, and the risks no one else could see. She quietly corrected them, added solutions he would later take credit for, and ensured everything aligned perfectly. When the board convened, Obina presented with his usual flair, expecting praise only to encounter subtle shifts. Questions arose he could not answer convincingly, and colleagues looked toward Aisha for solutions. Calm poised, she guided every answer, every correction, without ever drawing attention to herself. Obina's confidence wavered slightly, unnoticed by most, but observed keenly by her. By the end of the meeting, the deal succeeded not because of Obina's boastful claims, but because Aisha had orchestrated the outcome entirely. And yet, she remained in the shadows, letting him believe he had triumphed. His arrogance blinded him to her growing influence, his laughter echoing in the office as if mocking fate itself. Meanwhile, Aisha's internal victory strengthened her patience, sharpened her focus. Every whispered joke, every derisive glance, every casual dismissal of her abilities became fuel for a reckoning that would arrive at exactly the right moment. She had been betrayed, humiliated, and underestimated, but she had also learned, adapted, and positioned herself closer to the ultimate reveal. Fate, as always, remained her silent ally. Outside the office, Lagos roared on. Cars honked, generators hummed, and neon lights reflected on rain-slicked pavements. But inside, a quieter, deadlier game was unfolding. Aisha had learned to wield silence as a weapon, observation as a tool, and patience as armor. The world thought Obina controlled everything, but he controlled nothing without her. And when the time came, he would finally understand the cost of betrayal. By midweek, the subtle shifts Aisha had orchestrated began to ripple visibly through the office. Obina, once confident and smug, noticed unease in his colleagues' eyes, the way they deferred ever so slightly to her in meetings. He frowned but dismissed it, believing his charm and reputation still ruled. Aisha, however, thrived in the shadows, her influence spreading quietly, like water seeping into cracks unnoticed. Each interaction, each suggestion she made, carried weight he could never fully claim. She had learned to observe the smallest gestures, the tightening of a jaw, a flicker of doubt, a whispered question, and she used them to her advantage. One afternoon, a sudden crisis erupted. A critical client threatened to pull out of a lucrative deal, citing mismanagement. Obina panicked, scrambling for solutions, but Aisha was already several steps ahead. She analyzed the problem, predicted his moves, and intervened with subtle corrections that guided the outcome without anyone realizing it had been her initiative. When the client praised the quick response and effective leadership, Obina's chest swelled with pride, oblivious that every detail had been controlled by her. Even the team began to notice the quiet authority in her demeanor, the way she anticipated challenges before they appeared. The whispers in corridors changed tone, curiosity edging toward respect. Outside, Lagos carried on, neon signs reflecting off slick pavements. Cars honking, street vendors calling, oblivious to the high-stakes drama unfolding in the offices above. Aisha used this anonymity to her advantage, blending patience and strategy like a seasoned general. Later that evening, Obinna called a meeting to assert his dominance over an upcoming merger. He strutted into the boardroom, expecting admiration, but found subtle resistance. Colleagues questioned minor details, all of which Aisha had flagged discreetly beforehand, framing her suggestions as clarifications. Obinna struggled to maintain control. Every question he fumbled became another small victory for her. By the end, the merger was on track, but Obinna's authority had been quietly undermined. He didn't notice yet, but she did. Aisha felt a quiet satisfaction, tempered by restraint. She had not revealed her hand fully, not yet. The game required patience, timing, and precision. Her betrayal had been personal, devastating, but it had become a crucible forging her into a force Obinna could never anticipate. Fate had indeed been watching, shaping every step, and Aisha had learned to move in its rhythm. As she left the office that evening, the city lights reflecting on her calm face, she felt the balance of power beginning to tilt. The woman who had been deceived, humiliated, and underestimated was no longer invisible. She was calculating, prepared, and poised for the moment when the truth would finally shatter the illusions Obinna had built around himself. Every step she took was measured, deliberate, each decision a thread woven into the web that would soon ensnare him. And somewhere deep within, she smiled at the inevitability of justice, quiet but unstoppable. Obinna's first hint that something was amiss came on a Tuesday afternoon. He noticed the way colleagues looked at Aisha before responding, subtle nods acknowledging her insight before he even spoke. He caught a flicker of hesitation in board members' eyes, questions that had never been asked before, decisions second-guessed. Pride battled confusion inside him. He refused to admit that the woman he had betrayed might be orchestrating events behind the scenes. Aisha, meanwhile, remained outwardly calm, her every action calculated. She attended meetings, contributed subtly, corrected minor errors without drawing attention, all while Obinna's ego took the credit for her work. Lagos hummed outside, indifferent to the silent war unfolding in the skyscraper offices above, neon reflections dancing on rain-wet streets. One morning, a major contract unexpectedly threatened to collapse due to mismanagement from a department. Obinna thought he controlled completely. Panic flickered across his face, but Aisha had already identified the vulnerabilities and implemented precise adjustments days before. She guided solutions discreetly, each step invisible yet decisive. Colleagues began to rely on her instinctively, unaware that she had engineered the safety net. Obinna noticed the subtle changes too late. Each success she orchestrated undermining his authority without exposing her involvement. The tension in the office became palpable. Whispers followed her, not in suspicion, but in quiet admiration. Yet she remained unnoticed in her true power, letting him fumble and underestimate her further. One evening, after another long day, Obinna confronted her casually in the corridor, a forced smile masking irritation. "How did you know about that issue?" "I thought no one noticed," he said, trying to sound casual, but the edge in his voice betrayed anxiety. Aisha's smile was measured, almost imperceptible. "Just paying attention," she replied softly. He frowned, suspicious, but unable to pinpoint the source of her foresight. That night, Aisha reflected on how betrayal had become the catalyst for her transformation. The man who thought he controlled everything was blind to the reality she had quietly built. Every calculated move, every patient observation, every minor victory contributed to a web of influence no one else could perceive. Obinna remained oblivious, yet the subtle cracks in his confidence were widening. Fate had been watching, guiding her patience, shaping her resolve, ensuring that when the ultimate reveal came, it would strike with undeniable force. She walked the streets of Lagos alone, rain-slicked pavements reflecting city lights, her mind sharp, her purpose clear. The woman who had been hurt, humiliated, and laughed at was now a silent storm, prepared to reclaim power and teach the man who betrayed her the cost of underestimating someone who refused to remain a victim. Every step she took was deliberate, every choice calculated, every move part of a plan that was unstoppable, invisible, and inevitable. By the following week, The subtle power shift Aisha had orchestrated became impossible to ignore. Obina entered the office with his usual swagger, expecting obedience, admiration, and praise, but found hesitation instead. Colleagues glanced at each other before acting, unconsciously seeking Aisha's nod or input. Panic flickered in his eyes for the first time, a momentary crack in his carefully constructed armor. She observed silently, calculating her next moves, every smile, every gesture measured. The same client who had threatened to pull out of the deal returned, now praising Aisha directly for her foresight and guidance, oblivious to Obina's assumed control. His jaw tightened, his ego bruised, yet he still attempted to maintain dominance. Aisha allowed him to speak, to boast, to claim credit, but every word he uttered was subtly undercut by her invisible hand, correcting errors, guiding decisions, and redirecting outcomes. She had transformed betrayal into mastery, humiliation into leverage, patience into a weapon. Obina noticed the growing influence she wielded, but each observation only deepened his confusion. He could not trace the origin, yet his confidence wavered. One evening, a critical investor meeting arrived, the kind that could define the future of the company. Obina arrived early, preparing to dazzle, to charm, to assert control, while Aisha entered with quiet confidence, documents in hand, ready to guide the proceedings flawlessly. Questions arose that he could not answer. Subtle errors were caught before they could cause damage, all under Aisha's discreet management. The investors, impressed with the precision and smooth handling, assumed a level of organization and insight they attributed to the wrong person. Obina's frustration mounted, every attempt to steer the discussion foiled by the invisible influence she commanded. Later, alone in the office, he confronted her, attempting intimidation. "How do you always know what's coming? What are you doing behind my back?" Aisha's smile was calm, serene, almost unreadable. "I learned to watch, to wait, to act at the right time," she replied softly, her eyes steady. He felt the weight of her words, the unspoken threat hidden in patience. Lagos glimmered outside, indifferent to the human drama unfolding within glass walls, yet every step, every decision, every small correction had brought Aisha closer to the inevitable reveal. Obina had underestimated her, assumed she was powerless, laughed at her vulnerability, but now he sensed the power she wielded was unstoppable, quiet, and absolute. Each day, each meeting, each subtle maneuver built toward the day when betrayal would be repaid, not with anger or chaos, but with precision, with control, with undeniable truth. Aisha knew the final moment was near, the moment when Obina would realize that the woman he had betrayed, humiliated, and dismissed had quietly become the force he could not manipulate, the power he could not contain, and the reckoning he had ignored. Fate had been patient, guiding her moves, and the stage was set for the ultimate revelation. The day of reckoning arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly. Obina walked into the boardroom with his usual confidence, unaware that every step, every move, every decision he thought was his alone had already been orchestrated, guided, and perfected by Aisha. Colleagues watched, some with curiosity, some with barely concealed admiration, as she began presenting the final report on the company's most critical project. Numbers, forecasts, and strategic decisions flowed seamlessly, all decisions subtly influenced by her hand. Obina's smile faltered as he realized the room looked to her for guidance, the questions aimed at her, not him. Every investor, every board member, every colleague recognized precision and foresight he could not claim. He opened his mouth, ready to assert dominance, but no words came. The power he had believed was as crumbled quietly, invisibly, yet irreversibly. Aisha paused, looking around the room, her voice calm, composed, but carrying the weight of years of betrayal. "I trusted, I observed, and I acted when necessary. Every mistake avoided, every success achieved was not by chance. I have learned the cost of betrayal, and I have ensured it will never be repeated." Obina's face drained of color, the arrogance that had defined him now shattered. The whispers became audible as investors and colleagues exchanged glances, realizing the truth. The woman he had underestimated had quietly become the force behind every success. He stumbled through excuses, protests, feeble attempts to claim credit, but the evidence was irrefutable. Emails, reports, decisions all bore her fingerprints. The room, once his domain, was now hers. Lagos lights glimmered through the windows, the city unaware of the quiet storm that had dismantled pride, arrogance, and betrayal. Outside, the streets continued their endless pulse, yet within the boardroom, justice had been served. Aisha's eyes met Obina's one final time, calm, steady, victorious without the need for vengeance. She had been hurt, humiliated, laughed at, and discarded. But she had transformed betrayal into empowerment, pain into patience, and humiliation into mastery. Fate, which had watched silently for years, had guided her steps, ensuring the timing was perfect, the reveal unavoidable. Obina, the man who once thought he owned her trust, her love, and her loyalty, now understood the consequences of underestimating a woman wronged but unbroken. Aisha left the boardroom later, the weight lifted, a quiet smile on her face. She had reclaimed control, not with violence or malice, but with intelligence, resilience, and unwavering patience. Her journey from betrayal to mastery was complete, and the lesson lingered: trust, once broken, can forge strength. Betrayal, once endured, can produce power. And fate, always watching, rewards those who observe, endure, and act at precisely the right moment. She walked out into the Lagos evening, rain-slicked streets reflecting neon light, feeling a freedom that went beyond victory, a liberation born from patience, intelligence, and the quiet, unstoppable force of someone who refused to remain a victim. The woman who had been betrayed had become the architect of her own destiny, and the man who had tried to control her was left to witness the consequences of his own choices. Fate had indeed watched closely, and justice had been delivered in the most undeniable, irreversible way.